In a climate-controlled vault in Berlin, a clay tablet no larger than your palm holds something that shouldn't exist. Pressed into its surface 4,500 years ago are astronomical calculations tracking Venus with precision Europe wouldn't achieve for another 4,000 years. The Sumerian scribe who shaped this clay knew something we forgot. Or perhaps they were remembering something we never learned. Before we go further, if you're drawn to histories that refuse simple answers, consider subscribing. And if you're listening in the quiet hours, drop a comment telling me where you are right now. I want to imagine this mystery stretching across time zones while you drift towards sleep. The deserts of southern Iraq hold their breath beneath a sky that weighs like copper. Where the Euphrates once carved green corridors through endless sand, ruins rise in broken geometries. Temple platforms, defensive walls, the skeletal remains of cities that housed tens of thousands. Beneath these collapsed structures, buried under 5,000 years of wind and silence, rest the oldest continuous written records humanity has ever produced. They're made of clay, thousands upon thousands of tablets, each covered in wedge-shaped impressions that catch the light like bird tracks pressed into wet mud. Scholars call these marks cuneiform. The people who wrote them called themselves the black-headed people. We call them Sumerians. And from the moment European archaeologists began pulling these tablets from the earth in the 1800s, something in our understanding of human history began to crack. The discovery happened with dust, not fanfare. At Uruk, at Nippur, at Ur, excavators broke through sun-baked brick mounds and found chambers filled with clay fragments, stacked, catalogued, deliberately preserved. When linguists finally translated the script, they weren't reading the awkward first attempts of a civilization learning to express itself. They were reading astronomical tables, legal contracts, medical diagnoses prescribing combinations of thyme and fermented barley, multiplication tables teaching students compound interest, hymns to gods whose names hadn't been spoken in 4,000 years. This is not how beginnings are supposed to look. History teaches us to expect slow progression, stone tools evolving into bronze, simple shelters growing into planned cities, pictographs gradually becoming alphabets. Civilizations are born clumsy. They stumble before they walk. They experiment, fail, adapt, improve across centuries. Sumer skips the rehearsal. Around 3500 BC, cities emerge across southern Mesopotamia already carrying the vocabulary of sophistication. Urban planning with grid layouts, massive irrigation networks engineered with mathematical precision, a numerical system based on the number 60 that we still use today to measure time and angles, temple complexes aligned to track solstices, trade networks reaching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Their cuneiform script contains over 700 symbols in its earliest known form, not 10, not 50. 700 distinct characters capable of expressing abstract legal concepts, poetic metaphor, and astronomical measurement all at once. Scholars have spent over a century trying to explain this discontinuity. Some suggest we simply haven't found the developmental stages yet, that erosion has erased the fumbling centuries. Others propose Sumer inherited knowledge from neighbouring cultures whose names are lost. But the Sumerians themselves offer a different explanation, written in their own hand across temple walls and cylinder seals. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu, not invented, descended. And beneath that, carved into foundations meant to outlast empires, a phrase appears again and again. This is the restoration of what was before. Restoration, not creation. As if everything they built, every city, every star chart, every law code, was an act of remembering rather than innovation. Picture yourself in a museum archive after hours, when footsteps echo against marble and the galleries breathe in darkness. You pull on cotton gloves and lift one of these tablets from its padded tray. The clay feels cool, slightly rough beneath your fingers. Across its surface, hundreds of tiny wedge marks catch the overhead light, each one pressed deliberately by a reed stylus, held in a hand that ceased to exist 5,000 years ago. If you look closely enough, you can still see them. The fingerprints. Whorls and ridges pressed into the wet clay before it hardened, preserved like fossils. That person lived before the pyramids, before Chinese dynasties, before Mesoamerican temples. And they were recording something they believed was urgent enough to survive them. Among those records are things that shouldn't be there. Star catalogues tracking celestial bodies with accuracy we didn't match again until the invention of telescopes. Surgical procedures describing trepanation techniques. Mathematical problems calculating the area of irregular fields using formulas that wouldn't appear in Europe for 3,000 years. And woven through almost everything they wrote is a recurring theme. A world before the flood, when knowledge flowed freely, when rulers lived for impossible spans of time, when beings who came from the heavens taught humanity to measure the stars. It's easy to dismiss mythology as fantasy, as the human need to create gods and heroes. But when the same story appears across continents, in Akkadian epics, in Hebrew scripture, in Hindu texts, even in Mesoamerican codices, the repetition begins to sound less like coincidence and more like shared memory carried by survivors across thousands of miles and thousands of years. In 1922, archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating the ancient city of Ur when his team struck something unexpected beneath the occupation layers. A band of clean flood silt, sterile clay over 2 meters thick, deposited between two distinct periods of habitation. No pottery, no tools, no human presence, just mud. The same layer appears at Shuruppak, at Kish, at Eridu, all dated to roughly the same period, approximately 2900 BC. It wasn't a global deluge, but within the Sumerian world it was catastrophic enough to erase cities, to drown fields, to force entire populations to rebuild from fragments. And here's what makes Woolley's discovery unsettling. The Sumerians had already told us this would be there. Their tablets describe a world divided into before and after, separated by water and devastation. They weren't mythologizing, they were documenting. When archaeologists uncovered the Great Ziggurat at Uruk, they expected primitive foundations, rough stonework, trial and error construction. Instead, they found 6 miles of defensive walls built to precise specifications. Water systems channeling the Euphrates with geometric accuracy. A temple complex aligned to track the winter solstice. Buried in a collapsed library within the temple precinct, they discovered over 40,000 tablets, an archive vast enough to document every dimension of existence: trade, ritual, agriculture, astronomy, medicine, law. But nowhere in those 40,000 voices do the Sumerians claim to have invented what they knew. They describe receiving it, preserving it, restoring it from fragments left behind by those who came before. One phrase echoes across temple inscriptions and royal dedications, carved into stone meant to outlast empires, pressed into clay meant to survive fire. This is the restoration of what was before. Inside that Berlin vault, behind protective glass, a small cylinder seal rests under museum lighting. Its surface carries a dedication text describing the construction of a temple to Inanna, goddess of the evening star. Between the formal language of kingship and prayer, that phrase appears again. The restoration of what was before. And if you lean close enough to the glass that your breath fogs the surface, you can see them, the fingerprints of the scribe who shaped this cylinder 4,500 years ago, pressed into wet clay before it hardened forever. Those ridges and whorls belonged to someone who believed they were saving something, not creating it. Saving it from what? From time, from disaster, from the silence that swallows everything eventually. Maybe that's why these tablets still whisper across millennia. They weren't meant to announce a new dawn. They were meant to preserve the memory of what had come before, a world so thoroughly erased by catastrophe that only fragments survived, pressed into clay by hands that understood what it means to be the last generation that remembers. Clay doesn't burn. When buildings catch fire, when wooden shelves collapse, when empires fall and cities are abandoned to the sand, clay endures. The fires that consumed Sumerian archives didn't destroy their records, they baked them harder, preserving them like ceramics in a kiln. This is how memory survives, by accident, by catastrophe, by the very disasters meant to erase it. So let us return to that clay, to the moment when silence broke and humanity's oldest testimony began, to the ruins rising from Iraqi sand, where everything we think we know about our origins was written once, then buried for 3,000 years beneath empires that never knew Sumer had come before them. The tablets wait in the darkness, patient as stone, carrying a message from people who knew they were rebuilding on top of something older. And as wind moves across the empty plains where Eridu and Uruk once stood, you can almost hear what those ancient scribes were trying to tell us across the gulf of 50 centuries. This is not the beginning. This is what we managed to save. But if Sumer wasn't a beginning, then what exactly came before? To answer that, we must look not at what the Sumerians wrote, but at what they built, and how impossibly sophisticated it was from the very first stone. In the storerooms beneath the British Museum, tablets sit in numbered trays, catalogued by excavation site and approximate age. Most are administrative, grain allotments, worker rosters, temple inventories, mundane records from a civilization dead for 5 millennia. But tucked among the receipts and contracts are tablets that don't belong in the category we've assigned them. One fragment from Nippur, excavated in 1893, contains a king list. It opens with 8 rulers, each reigning for tens of thousands of years. Then comes a single line, the flood swept over. After that line, the reigns drop suddenly to reasonable human lifespans. 2 kings, 43 years, then another, then another. Scholars call this mythology blending into history. But the Sumerians made no such distinction. They catalogued these kings with the same precision they used to record barley taxes. Another tablet describes the layout of Eridu's temple. Not its construction, its reconstruction. The inscription states the temple was rebuilt according to its original plan from ancient times, but Eridu is considered the oldest Sumerian city. Original to what? At Uruk, archaeologists found a cadastral survey documenting field boundaries across the entire city-state. This requires geometry, standardized measurement, and bureaucratic continuity across generations, all present in the earliest layers, no trial phase, no simpler predecessor. The cuneiform script itself offers no ancestry. Linguists expect writing systems to evolve from pictographs into abstraction over centuries. Egyptian hieroglyphs show this progression clearly. Chinese characters developed gradually. But Sumerian appears with over 700 symbols already capable of expressing legal nuance, poetic metaphor, and mathematical abstraction simultaneously. It's not that we found the beginning of writing, we found writing that was already fluent. And embedded in that fluency is a recurring insistence. This is the restoration of what was before. If the Sumerians were not recording beginnings, then what exactly were they remembering? Around 3500 BC, Uruk becomes a city, not gradually, not through centuries of expanding villages. It appears as a fully realized urban centre housing between 40,000 and 80,000 people, protected by 6 miles of defensive walls that required millions of mud bricks, each one standardized to identical dimensions. This level of coordination implies centralized planning, labor management, resource allocation, and architectural knowledge that should have taken generations to develop. Yet the archaeological layers show no apprenticeship period. Uruk simply is. Beneath those walls run irrigation canals engineered with geometric precision, channeling the Euphrates through calculated angles to maximize agricultural yield. The mathematics required for this, surveying, slope calculation, water volume management, appears complete from the first digs into Earth. The Sumerians measured everything using a sexagesimal system, dividing circles into 360 degrees, hours into 60 minutes, minutes into 60 seconds. We inherited this system without understanding its origin. No culture before or since has independently developed base 60 mathematics. It requires abstract thinking sophisticated enough to recognize that 60 has 12 factors, making it ideal for division and astronomical calculation. Egypt's urban development shows clear progression, from pre-dynastic villages to early dynastic ceremonial centers over 1,000 years. The Indus Valley follows a similar trajectory. China's cities emerge gradually from Neolithic settlements. Archaeological records document their growing pains, their experiments, their failures. Sumer skips this entirely. Between the Ubaid period villages, simple farming communities with basic pottery, and Sumerian cities, there should be transitional layers, settlements growing more complex, architecture becoming more ambitious, social hierarchies crystallizing slowly into urban organization. Those layers don't exist. Archaeologists have searched for decades. The gap remains. And in professional publications, when pressed to explain it, they use careful language. Anomalous development, unclear antecedents, insufficient data. What they mean is, we don't know where this came from. Meanwhile, beneath the streets of these cities lay something even more troubling, evidence that the Sumerians themselves didn't claim to be the source. If Sumer did not slowly develop its knowledge, where did that knowledge come from? Languages leave family trees. Latin becomes Italian, French, Spanish. Sanskrit branches into Hindi, Bengali, Persian. Even isolated tribal languages show phonetic cousins within their regions. Linguists trace these relationships backward through sound shifts, shared vocabulary, grammatical echoes, reconstructing parent tongues that existed thousands of years before writing. Sumerian has no relatives, none we've ever found. It's called a language isolate, which is a polite academic term for orphan. Every attempt to connect it to surrounding language families, Semitic, Indo-European, Dravidian, has failed. Its structure is fundamentally different. Agglutinative, meaning it builds complexity by stacking grammatical elements onto root words like beads on a string. This is unusual but not unique. What's unusual is that Sumerian appears in written form without any developmental ancestor. Compare this to Akkadian, the Semitic language that eventually replaced Sumerian in Mesopotamia. Akkadian has clear relatives: Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic. Its evolution is traceable. We can see its grammar simplifying over centuries, its vocabulary shifting, its script adapting. Sumerian offers no such continuity. It appears fully formed in 3500 BC. Then, around 2000 BC, it stops being spoken. But here's what unsettles linguists. For another 1500 years, scribes continue copying Sumerian texts in temple schools. They preserve pronunciation guides, grammar exercises, and bilingual dictionaries, even though no one speaks it anymore. Why preserve a dead language for over a millennium unless what it contained was considered irreplaceable? By the time of Babylon's height, scribal students were copying Sumerian hymns they no longer fully understood, maintaining rituals in a tongue that had become sacred precisely because it was ancient. The language had fossilized into liturgy, but fossils imply something once lived. If Sumerian's linguistic family vanished so completely that no trace remains, not in neighbouring dialects, not in substrate vocabulary, not even in place names outside Sumer itself, then an entire population disappeared without descendants. If the language survived but its relatives vanished, what happened to the people who once spoke them? In 1929, archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating a royal cemetery at Ur when his workers' shovels struck something unexpected. Beneath the burial layers, beneath the pottery and jewellery and skeletal remains, they found clean water-deposited clay, over 2 meters thick, sterile. No artefacts, no organic material, just silt. Woolley ordered them to dig deeper. Below the clay, occupation layers resumed. Houses, tools, pottery shards, evidence of a thriving settlement. Then abruptly, mud. Then nothing. Then, above the mud, civilization beginning again. The workers assumed they'd reached virgin soil, the natural foundation beneath human history. Woolley knew better. Virgin soil doesn't appear sandwiched between two periods of habitation. This wasn't the bottom. This was an interruption. He found the same layer at Shuruppak, at Kish, at Eridu. Each site showed identical stratigraphy, a band of clean flood silt separating older occupation from newer construction. Geological analysis dated the deposits to approximately 2900 BC. Not a global deluge. The evidence doesn't support that. But within the Mesopotamian floodplain, where the Tigris and Euphrates could swell beyond recognition during seasonal storms, this would have been annihilation. Every city drowned, every field submerged, every record lost except what survived in the minds of those who reached higher ground. The cities rebuilt directly atop the mud. Same locations, same orientations. As if the survivors knew exactly where the sacred centres had been and refused to abandon them. What disturbs archaeologists isn't the flood itself. Catastrophic floods are common in river valleys. What disturbs them is how the Sumerians processed it. Their chronicles don't treat the flood as one disaster among many. They treat it as the event that divided time itself into before and after. But then, written evidence appeared that mirrored the mud exactly. How did the Sumerians themselves describe the world that existed before the waters came? The Sumerian king list exists in multiple copies, inscribed across different centuries and discovered at different sites: Nippur, Lhasa, Isin. Each version follows the same structure, listing rulers in chronological sequence with the length of their reigns. Historians use these lists to reconstruct dynastic timelines, cross-referencing names with archaeological findings. But the list doesn't begin with historical kings. It begins with 8 rulers who reigned before the flood, each holding kingship for spans measured in tens of thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alalgar, 36,000 years. The numbers continue, impossibly vast, until the 8th king. Then comes a single line. The flood swept over. After that line, everything changes. The reigns drop to human lifespans. Etana of Kij, 1,500 years, still long but conceivable as a dynastic line compressed into a single name, then shorter still, until by the time we reach rulers we can verify archaeologically, like Gilgamesh of Uruk, the reigns match reasonable human ages. Scholars treat the antediluvian section as mythology, origin stories meant to grant divine legitimacy to later dynasties, but the Sumerians formatted it identically to the historical section. Same verb, tenses. Same bureaucratic precision, no narrative embellishment. Just names, cities and reign lengths recorded as fact. The numbers themselves show mathematical regularity. Many are multiples of 60, the base of Sumerian mathematics. This suggests intentional calculation, not arbitrary mythology. Some researchers propose the figures represent dynastic periods rather than individual lifetimes, or that they're symbolic, encoding astronomical cycles. But the text never signals this. It simply states, these kings ruled for these durations, and then the flood came. More troubling is what comes after. The list resumes without interruption. Kingship didn't begin again after the flood, it continued, as if the institution survived the catastrophe intact, carried forward by those who remembered how things had been organised before. If kingship existed before the flood, then what kind of world did those early humans inhabit? The Atrahasis epic, inscribed on tablets dating to around 1700 BC but preserving far older material, describes human creation not as a divine pronouncement, but as a solution to a labour problem. The The gods were exhausted from digging irrigation canals, maintaining the earth, performing the endless work required to sustain existence. They rebelled. A council convened. The solution: create workers. Humans were formed from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, divine essence blended with earth. But the text describes failure first. Early attempts produced beings who couldn't reproduce, or couldn't speak, or died too quickly. Adjustments were made, trials repeated. Eventually a viable prototype emerged. This is creation as engineering, not miracle. The Eridu Genesis offers a similar account. Humanity fashioned deliberately, assigned tasks, given tools. Nowhere in these narratives do humans appear as the pinnacle of creation or rulers of the earth. They appear as labourers, functional, necessary, but fundamentally subordinate. Compare this to later creation myths. Genesis describes instantaneous divine command, "Let there be." The gods of Olympus shape humans from nothing with effortless thought. But Sumerian gods are portrayed as limited, tired, collaborative, more like skilled craftsmen than omnipotent beings. This distinction matters. Craftsmen work with materials, they test, they refine, they solve problems iteratively. The Sumerian creation accounts read less like theology and more like process documentation. And then there's the flood. In Atrahasis, the deluge isn't divine punishment for sin, it's population control. Humanity had grown too numerous, too loud. The gods decided to reset. One god warned a man named Atrahasis. He built a boat. He survived. Civilization resumed. The structure is identical across texts separated by centuries: warning, construction, catastrophe, survival, rebuilding. Meanwhile, the same stories appeared again, far from Sumer, in languages unrelated to cuneiform, among cultures with no known contact. Why do similar stories of floods and creation appear across cultures separated by oceans? When scholars first translated the Akkadian Epic of Gilgamesh in the 1870s, they found something unsettling embedded in Tablet Mi, a flood narrative nearly identical to the biblical account in Genesis, but written over 1,000 years earlier. A man warned by a god, instructions to build a boat, specific dimensions provided, animals brought aboard, waters covering the earth, a bird sent out to find dry land, the boat resting on a mountain, sacrifice offered after survival. The parallels weren't vague thematic echoes, they were structural twins. Then scholars found the same pattern in the Atrahasis epic, then in earlier Sumerian fragments describing Ziusudra, the flood hero of Eridu, each version older than the last, each preserving the same sequence: divine warning, construction, catastrophe, survival, covenant. The Hebrew Genesis account, once thought to be unique revelation, began to look like cultural inheritance. But the transmission didn't stop at the Mediterranean. Flood myths appear in over 200 cultures worldwide, many with no historical contact with Mesopotamia. The Matsya Purana in India describes Manu building a boat after being warned by a fish avatar. Greek mythology preserves Deucalion's flood. Mesoamerican codices describe world-destroying waters. Indigenous Australian, Chinese and Native American traditions all contain deluge narratives with survivors who restart civilization. Anthropologists initially explained this as coincidence. River valley cultures naturally develop flood myths. But the specificity troubles that explanation. It's not just flooding, it's the warning, the vessel, the animals, the mountain, the new beginning. What's preserved isn't generic disaster memory. It's a specific story, adapted across languages and millennia, but retaining its essential architecture. Oral tradition carried it for thousands of years before writing fixed it into permanence. Each culture shaped the details to fit their gods, their landscapes, their values, but the skeleton remained. Memory adapting, not inventing. If these stories were inherited, not invented, what role did writing play in preserving them? Writing wasn't invented to tell stories. The earliest cuneiform tablets are receipts, records of barley distributed to temple workers, inventories of livestock, contracts documenting land transactions. Administrative memory externalized into clay so that agreements could outlast individual lifetimes. But memory has another function. It protects against forgetting. Sumerian scribes didn't just record the present. They copied older texts obsessively, generation after generation, preserving hymns, king lists, star charts, and creation accounts long after the language itself had died. By the time Babylon rose to power, Scribal students were learning Sumerian the way medieval monks learned Latin, not to speak it, but to access what had been written in it. This dedication suggests urgency. Writing became the technology of survival. Clay tablets are nearly indestructible. When buildings burned, wooden shelves collapsed and archives were abandoned, the fires that consumed everything else baked the tablets harder, turning them into ceramics. The disasters meant to erase them instead preserved them. Accidental immortality. Scribes understood this fragility. Temple foundations contain dedicatory inscriptions describing renovations, but the language is careful. This is the restoration of what was before. Not construction. Restoration. As if every act of building was an attempt to recover something already lost. The repetition of that phrase across centuries, across cities, across dynasties, reveals an underlying anxiety. The Sumerians feared losing what they had inherited. Writing was their countermeasure. They didn't write to innovate, they wrote to remember, and what they remembered, they framed as older than themselves, knowledge passed down from before the flood, from kings who lived impossible lifespans, from gods who taught humanity to measure the stars, and finally, we return to the clay itself, to those fingerprints pressed into wet tablets 5,000 years ago. What does it mean that the oldest human writings were acts of remembrance, not invention? Chapter 9. The Last Generation That Remembered. In museum archives around the world, Sumerian tablets rest in climate-controlled darkness. Each one carries the texture of the hands that shaped it, ridges and whorls preserved in hardened clay. Those fingerprints belong to people who lived closer in time to the flood they described than we live to them. They were rebuilders, not pioneers. Everything they constructed, cities with geometric precision, irrigation systems calculated to the degree, mathematical frameworks we still use to measure circles and time, was presented as restoration. The phrase appears so consistently across their inscriptions that it stops feeling like rhetoric and starts feeling like confession. This is the restoration of what was before the water, before the silence, before the knowledge nearly disappeared. The Sumerians emerged into history already literate, already urban, already sophisticated, not because they invented these capacities, but because they inherited fragments and refused to let them vanish. Their cuneiform wasn't humanity's first attempt at writing. It was humanity's first successful act of preservation. They documented a king list that divided time into before and after. They copied creation narratives describing trial and error, not divine proclamation. They preserved flood accounts that appeared again across unconnected cultures, carried by oral tradition until writing could fix them permanently. And they did this knowing that clay survives what flesh cannot, that fires bake tablets harder instead of destroying them. That memory, once externalized, can outlast empires. Historians argue over what the Sumerians knew and how they knew it, but the tablets themselves don't argue. They simply testify. We are saving what was given to us. Perhaps that's what defines us, not where we began, but what we chose to carry forward through catastrophe. Not innovation, but refusal to forget. The wind still moves across southern Iraq, over ruins that once held 40,000 voices. The clay waits beneath the sand, patient and silent. Perhaps the Sumerians did not tell us where humanity began, but they showed us how memory survives when everything else is lost.